Thank you all for coming. And I hope you have the handout because I've got 100 slides and we'll go kind of fast. So that you don't need to take notes since everything is on the handout. And the first is introduction, a little bit about Charles Gounod. He just used the two names. He composed 12 operas, but he's basically remembered for Faust. That's the one we think of with his name. It was not as well received in its opening, in its premiere, as people hoped, but little by little it gathered audiences and got revivals, and people realized this is a really important opera, so it's part of the standard repertoire. But many people would say that his Romeo and Juliet is actually his best work. And that too was well received in its very first performance. Audiences loved it. And some have said it's the best of all of the 25 opera versions of Romeo and Juliet. Now, in one of these, in the Encyclopedia of the Opera, it says there have been 80 operas based on Romeo and Juliet. So it's a very popular subject for opera and obviously works very well. But this Gounod made it very emotional in the music. And so people loved it. However, even though they loved the music, they questioned choosing Shakespeare as a subject matter. The French are always a little bit put off by Shakespeare, to put it politely. And in fact, even as late as Gounod, 1867, a reviewer said it's a great opera, but there's so much English bad taste in it. And it's always necessary to clean up the vulgarisms in Shakespeare. So the French had always been wary of Shakespeare, and we really didn't even accept Shakespeare on the stage until opera in the mid-19th century. And as plays, it took a while longer, even in the 20th century. But Gounod composed a total of 12 operas. Other people had done operas based on Shakespeare, but they were mostly Italian, if they were in a foreign language. But Gounod had very experienced librettists for Roméo and Juliette. Jules Barbier and Michel Carré were very good, but they stayed closer to the original Shakespeare text than virtually any other that had gone before, although they certainly took liberties, as we will mention. Barbier was a playwright as well as an opera librettist, and he wrote a play called Joan of Arc, which was Sarah Bernhardt, even when she was in her 70s, played 19-year-old Joan of Arc in the trial scene of Barbier's play. Carré, and so kind of to return the favor for all the libretti that Barbier had written for Gounod. Gounod wrote incidental music for Barbier's play, Joan of Arc. Michel Carré didn't work with Gounod quite as often, but on the good ones. Faust, and one based on a Molière play, Doctor in Spite of Himself, and then, of course, the great Roméo and Juliette. Well, although France was very wary of Shakespeare. In fact, it was a long, not quite love, but affection-hate relationship with Shakespeare in France. Nowadays, in the 21st century, Shakespeare has actually surpassed Molière in number of productions that they can see in France, theaters throughout the country. This was a special issue of their popular magazine, Le Point, totally devoted to Shakespeare. So to back up a little bit and look at the long history of French antipathy towards Shakespeare and how Gounod or others of his period helped tame the barbarian, to go back to the beginning, of course, there was always a sticky relationship between France and England, from Shakespeare's plays, Henry V. So it was a 1,000-year rivalry. The Italian Renaissance had started in Italy and gradually worked its way north. So from Italy, the mother of the arts, France was the next most prestigious country for the Renaissance. And then the Renaissance had to leap the channel to get to England, and there was this sea change. It wasn't quite the same thing. Yes, they knew their Greek and Latin classics, but they didn't devote themselves as totally to the Greek and Latin classics as the Italians and the French had done for their Renaissance. So Greek and Roman classics were considered by the French to be the hallmark of civilization. And so France and Italy were the most civilized lands because they were the closest to Greek and Latin. Whereas in England and Scandinavia, Germany, they didn't accept the classics as readily. And so the French just regarded them as uncouth or not as civilized as they were. French culture continued to revere the classics right up through the 19th century, as you'll see. The peak, of course, was the 17th century, the great century, the period of Louis XIV and Molière. That century was called, the arts of that century were called neoclassicism, a renewed or revival of the classics and obeying what they considered to be the classical rules for art. They read Aristotle and kind of reinterpreted Aristotle a little more stringently than Aristotle intended. So you see very quickly some of the rules down here, no vulgarity, and that is both language and plot, storyline. If it's a tragedy, you don't contaminate tragedy with scenes of comedy. Now, actually, the Greeks had done that a little bit, but it's not the French. You kept it pure. And that also meant no mingling of classes. If it was a tragedy, you could have kings and aristocrats, nobles. You didn't bring a peasant into a tragedy. Well, you certainly never had a king and a peasant character in the same room in a play. And then, of course, the unities of time, place, and action, that was where they overinterpreted Aristotle and said all the action had to be in 24 hours in a place you could get to in 24 hours. And so the action very, very tight, very compressed. If the classical plays started at a late point in time when things were already underway, decisions already being made. So it was like a coiled spring when you got to how it all turned out. And that was typical of the classics plays, very tightly structured. And also in terms of language, in France, the plays were written in Alexandrines, which were 12-syllable rhymed couplets, considered that was the French equivalent of our iambic pentameter. Well, during the 17th century, the British monarchy was driven out by the Commonwealth under Oliver Cromwell. And where did the British monarchy and the aristocrats go? Well, to France. They actually sponged off the French court for the 18 years of Oliver Cromwell. And you'd think they would teach the French about the great Shakespeare of a couple generations back, but no, they didn't. Instead, the British became French. They learned to love French arts, well, especially theater, because the French had women on stage and the British never had that before. So the French monarchy absorbed the French ideas of art. And then when the Commonwealth or interregnum ended in 1660 and Charles II made a triumphant return to England and became the monarchy was restored in the Restoration. There had been 18 years in England under the Puritans of Oliver Cromwell, no theater. All the Elizabethan theaters had been pulled down. Nobody had read Shakespeare. There were no actors, unless they'd been working underground. And so it meant they could sort of start at zero. And they started with French ideas. And instead of having the big public playhouses open to the public, as in Shakespeare's day, It was theater for the aristocrats. So in the olden days of the Elizabethans, it had been 2,000 seat theaters, and now maybe 700 or 800. You had the aristocrats who had the leisure and the money to attend theater, and then they have their servants in the upper gallery to be ready for them when they left the theater. So it was a very, very different theater in England. And following the French influence, they wanted their Shakespeare to be polite. Yes, they did start looking back, and they didn't have any playwrights after 18 years. So they had to sort of resurrect old playwrights, and they got out the Shakespeare, and they were appalled. They knew that the French would never stand for this kind of thing. And so playwrights got busy revising Shakespeare, even for the English audiences, just toning him down, making him more polite, tightening him up, throwing out scenes that were questionable in taste. And David Garrick, who was responsible for the regeneration of Shakespeare in the 18th century, for Shakespeare's revival of his reputation. He had a big festival of Shakespeare in Stratford-upon-Avon, kind of put that town on the map because of David Garrick. But he revised Shakespeare's plays to make them polite. He changed the endings. He threw out scenes. And in Romeo and Juliet, one of his most famous changes was to change the ending. He said he didn't like Shakespeare with when Romeo dies before Juliet wakes up. You're squandering the opportunity for one last poignant encounter between the two. So Juliet does, Romeo has already drunk the poison, but before he dies, Juliet wakes up and they can have a love duet. And Gounod kept that change to Shakespeare. In fact, that was such a popular change that it was the standard ending for the next 100 years, 18th century and even on beyond that. Well, the main culprit in the French antipathy towards Shakespeare was Voltaire. He was in exile in England for 2 years. And during that time, he learned a little bit of English, not much. He saw a few Shakespeare plays, but he attended Julius Caesar and he saw the audience was so involved, so emotional, far more than he'd seen his French audiences get emotional at his plays. So when he finally was able to go back to France, he started talking up Shakespeare. They have this great playwright. He can bring women to tears. And so his first, it was a burst of enthusiasm immediately on his return to France. But very soon, especially after, I'll jump ahead, he wrote a play about Julius Caesar called The Death of Caesar. But it stayed within the classical form. He kept the neoclassical rules very tightened up, and he was hoping that without violating neoclassicism, he could get that kind of emotional response from an audience that he had seen in England. Well, it didn't work. The play flopped, and so that's when Voltaire began to badmouth Shakespeare. In contrast to his initial enthusiastic reaction. And he listed Shakespeare's fault. Language and story are indecent in so many ways. He paid no attention to the classical unities. He brought kings and peasants together and comedy and tragedy in the same play. And there was so much violence in Shakespeare that would offend delicate, refined French sensibilities. So Voltaire switched to being the enemy of Shakespeare in France, and he was very, very influential. But he thought he could borrow some of those techniques. And so in his play Semiramis, he used the idea of a ghost, which to the French, that's kind of sticky. Is that in good taste or not? Well, it wasn't the ghost so much, but in those days, they sold high-priced seats to audience members on the stage. really wealthy people loved to buy tickets to sit on the little chairs right there on the stage with the actors brushing past them, because then they could be seen by the audience. And their finery could be admired while people were also watching the play. The opening of Semiramis, so many people were sitting on stage, or they even sold standing room on stage, so that at one point the stage manager had to say, "Make way for the ghost." Pushing the audience members aside so the ghost could get through and make his entrance. I mean, did you ever hear of a ghost that had to have people step aside for it? Voltaire was enraged. In a way, it was a good thing, because he was so enraged, he used all his influence to end the practice of selling seats to people on stage in the 1750s, same time David Garrick did it for the English stage. Of course, the theater owners were resistant because those seats sold for a much higher price. But Voltaire had the influence to get someone to enlarge the seating capacity of the actual auditorium, so the theater owner didn't lose too much money. At last there was a translation of Shakespeare into French, however, by Laplace. But it wasn't a real translation. It was a kind of Reader's Digest version of Shakespeare. There would be little snatches of dialogue and then summary, and then no mention at all of the questionable scenes that might have been indelicate to the French. And then the next one was Le Tourneur, who translated the plays in 20 volumes, and he did translate most of the plays into dialogue, but it was all in prose. He where Shakespeare goes into poetry, he didn't. It was totally prose, but at least it was a reading example of it was a story. They were storytelling plays, and the 2 volumes sold out. They sold like mad. Everybody was avid to read these wonderful stories. Thing was, they didn't get produced. They were read as plays on the page and did not make it to the stage. And the printed translations, if you can call it that, was so popular that Voltaire became enraged. Now, probably what Voltaire was enraged about was that Le Tourneur's introduction to these volumes did not mention that Voltaire had been the first one to talk about Shakespeare and enlighten the French about the existence of this barbarian across the Channel. So he wrote about it first privately. Have you read that dimwit's 2 volumes? He sacrifices everything French to his idol Shakespeare, just as they used to sacrifice pigs to Ceres. And there's his claim. It is I who was the first to show the French some pearls which I had found in Shakespeare's dunghill. And then he actually carried his quarrel with the long departed, 2 centuries old Shakespeare. He carried it to the Académie Française, the 40 immortals, the guardians of the French language, and castigated Le Tourneur's translation. But he had to admit, this Shakespeare, so low, so savage, so excessive, and so absurd, had some sparks of genius. Yes, messieurs, in the dark chaos composed of murders and idiocies, heroics and turpitude, and puffed up speeches, there are some striking, believable moments. But he just didn't want to admit that Shakespeare could be more interesting than any French author. Well, Voltaire died a couple of years later, but his influence lingered on long after his death. He was probably the greatest influence for the longest time on French culture in terms of his censorious attitude toward Shakespeare. And of course, in the historical context, this was echoed by continuing rivalry or France and England being on different sides in the American Revolution, because the French, especially the Marquis de Lafayette, came over and rode with Washington, fought beside him. The great French playwright Beaumarchais sent arms secretly, French arms to help the Americans, and of course against the British. So there was that continuing rivalry. Another quotation by Voltaire: Shakespeare is a drunken savage with some imagination, whose plays please only in London and Canada. Canada, end of the earth. Well, so as late as the 18th century, Shakespeare's plays were still known as reading, something to read for enjoyment on the page, but they weren't produced. And even reading the plays, the French found things to be offended by. The very existence of the gravedigger scene in Hamlet was offensive. They were squeamish about the dialogue. Who listening to two gravediggers? This is like having peasants speak poetry. No, I mean, we're not. And then when Laertes and Hamlet jump into Ophelia's grave, this was really, really icky. Now, the next so-called translator of Shakespeare into French didn't know any English at all. He didn't know a word of English, but he was touted as being the first really important translator of Shakespeare into English. And he's a very interesting guy, Jean-François Ducis. You see him here, a wonderful portrait of him in the ecstasy of translating Shakespeare into French. Well, what he did, since he didn't know English, was he gathered together all of the existing versions of Shakespeare in French and then wrote his own play. Whatever, he reimagined plots and characters and just incredible changes. And still keeping it clean for the French. He did several plays, including Romeo and Juliet, and he translated Hamlet. He left out the ghost and the gravediggers, and did away with the violence. But Hamlet in 1769 was the first Shakespeare play to reach the stage in French, to reach the French stage, the very first one. And so it's kind of a milestone, but it's not Shakespeare. It's nothing like the Shakespeare we know and love. For example, someone in this audience knows the opening line of Shakespeare, of Hamlet, right? We all know the opening line of Hamlet. What is it?
Who's there?
Yes. Who's there? That's one of the most famous opening lines in all of dramatic literature. Who's there? I mean, because it's, symbolic. Who's there? What is the person? I mean, who, but in this case, who's there? It's the watchman in the night, in the castle at night. And the watchman doesn't say it. It's the one who's coming and says, who's there? And then the watchman answers, nay, answer me, because the real watchman is supposed to be the one who calls out, stand and unfold yourself. Bernardo? You come most carefully upon your hour, because this thing has walked again. Well, that's the real Shakespeare. What did Ducis do, who was not bound by knowing any English and livened it? Look at that opening speech there. All in French Alexandrines. It's Claudius and Polonius starting the play with a long discussion in long speeches. Totally the opposite of Shakespeare or the scene on the battlements. He really had his way with Shakespeare, and the language, turning it into the language of French. So Gisseron wrote about Shakespeare in France and said of Ducis, his sincerity is flawless. His ignorance of English is absolute. He admires Shakespeare passionately and labors to mutilate his plays. in order to increase the fame of the great man and induce the French public to appreciate him. Well, deceased had a good long life, lived, well into the 19th century. He said when he was translating King Lear, he trembled every moment to depict a king going mad, because this might offend the monarchy of France. And he was just really nervous about a lot of what. And his friends said, no, you can't show that. That's too horrible. Leave that out. But he did. And then what happened? Then came the French Revolution, 1789. Blood was running in the streets. Huge crowds gathered to watch the guillotine. They would string up aristocrats on the lampposts and set them afire. What business did the French have talking about English barbarity? This Shakespeare was nothing compared to what the French did during the Revolution. So this should have been a big turning point. And in some ways it was, because then melodrama was the next big form of theater in France. And there's a lot in Shakespeare that we could call melodramatic. So we're kind of inching our way into Shakespeare. Now, Voltaire's influence continued even after the French Revolution. And just interesting sidelight, the 40 immortals of the French Academy, when one dies, it leaves the seat and it goes to the next one, who has to make a speech in honor of the person who had that seat before. So when Voltaire died, it was a deceased who got his seat, the great translator of Shakespeare, who brought Shakespeare to the French stage. Chateaubriand, I love these quotes too. Chateaubriand was a sort of pre-romantic, and it was the romantics who finally appreciated Shakespeare. But Chateaubriand said, a nation that knows the rules of art cannot accept monsters without risking its own morals. And in this respect, the liking for Shakespeare is far more dangerous in France than in England. With the English, it's only ignorance, but in France, it's depravity. And then I love this quote, bad taste and vice nearly always go together. Wouldn't it be good if that were true? Okay, so the next big movement is in the early 19th century, the Romantic movement. And this is a brief window of appreciation for Shakespeare. Romanticism held the stage everywhere in the 19th century, but in France, let's say in theater, in French theater, it was only 13 years, 1830 to 1843. Now, Romantic painting and music lasted a lot longer than that, but on the stage, only those 13 years of Romanticism. So these are the characteristics of Romanticism. We don't need to go through all of them, but if you just glance through them, you see they're all what you find in Shakespeare. Shakespeare was about feelings and emotion rather than logic and reason. So all of those things apply to Shakespeare as well as to the Romantic movement. And so, yes, they were ready to welcome Shakespeare, and hesitatingly. And so, how did Shakespeare win acceptance? Well, this is how Romanticism won acceptance. And again, I'm not going to go through every one of them, but melodrama helped, and then Madame de Staël wrote a book about the Storm and Stress movement in Germany. And so that was kind of a pre-Romanticism. And she said that Nordic culture, Christian culture, was actually more exciting than restricted pagan Latin and Greek. Stendhal wrote his most famous book, of course, was The Red and the Black, but he wrote a pamphlet called Racine and Shakespeare. Racine, the greatest dramatic poet in all of French theater history. And comparing him to Shakespeare, and who won? Shakespeare. Stendhal, it's like almost heresy to say we should be looking at Shakespeare. He might be greater than the great Racine. So this was very influential. And then a troupe of English players came to Paris in 1822, and they did not do well. For one thing, they weren't very good actors. But for the other thing, 1822, this is only 7 years after the French were defeated at Waterloo. Napoleon was defeated by the French. And so the French were still holding a grudge against the English. So when these English players came, the French audiences threw chairs and benches onto the stage, as well as whatever rotten fruit they might have brought. The polite people found a smaller theater for the English, who limped on for another week. But that really didn't make much headway for Shakespeare. But 5 years later, another company of English players came to France and performed in English also. And this one, the French went wild. This company stayed 2 years in Paris. Charles Kemble, of course, was a star actor. And then there was this little Irish actress, Harriet Smithson. And the public just adulated them. They were just blown away because there was so much emotion. Even though most of the audiences couldn't understand the English, they had read the outline. There was a synopsis in the program, and they were watching the facial expressions and hearing the vocal modulations and just going crazy over them. And so here we have Kemble and Smithson in Romeo and Juliet. Yeah, both that one and this one. And they were appalled at seeing aristocrats and servants interacting in the English way. But the Romantics said, this is our champion. So, and then of course in Hamlet, there were other things that offended people, but Romantics like Alexander Dumas, the elder, said, it's the first time I'd seen real passion in the theater. It left him breathless. He could never go back. And so he wrote things like Count of Monte Cristo, his plays. One of the things that was the most scandalous was when Harriet Smithson, as Ophelia, in her mad scene, came staggering in, playing mad. She had bits of straw stuck in her hair. To the French, this was obscene. It was in such bad taste. Bits of straw in a lady's hair. And it doesn't show up very well, but on the cover of this biography, and then you can see it a little bit in this depiction. The composer Hector Berlioz fell in love with Harriet Smithson, and he was pursuing her the whole time the company was in Paris, those 2 years, and he too was blown away by Shakespeare. A flash of lightning that opened the heaven of art, sublime tumult, and so on. So he was in love with Harriet Smithson and with Shakespeare. And again, he recalled seeing Hamlet and all of its really overblown language. I won't read the whole thing, but it was the shock of something new and exciting and passionate. And so he wrote his Symphonie Fantastique in 1830, first year of Romantic theater in France, for her, inspired by her. And she finally married him. The marriage, of course, didn't work out because he never really learned English, and she definitely never learned French. So she sat around drinking and carping at him. and he tried. It took him a while, but he finally fell out of love with her. And they separated, but he paid for her for the rest of her life. But he did go on, and because of having been inspired by her performances as Juliette, he wrote his dramatic symphony, Roméo et Juliette, in 1839. And that is considered a masterpiece of Romantic music. In fact, my husband and I were given 78 records of this Berlioz piece for as a wedding gift. So it was a real musical appreciation of Shakespeare, and 30 years later would be a source of inspiration for Gounod's real opera, Roméo et Juliette. because Gounod was a student at the Conservatoire in Paris when Berlioz was rehearsing his dramatic symphony, Romeo and Juliet. And Gounod heard it down the hall and came. He was entranced. He just had to listen. He was sort of blown away with it. And he didn't dare kind of approach Berlioz at that point because he was only a student. But later on, they became friends. And there was a lot of letters between them that have survived. So Berlioz's Romeo and Juliet remained a sort of in the subtext of Gounod's memory for 30 years until it finally blossomed. That seed had been planted and it blossomed in the opera Roméo et Juliette. Well, one of the big names in Romanticism and the whole 19th century is Victor Hugo. He was a poet, a playwright, a novelist, a painter, a little bit of a major ego, of course. But he was the leader of Romanticism. He thought he was writing the first great romantic play. It was called Cromwell, about the interregnum in England of a century earlier. And it never got produced. It was just too big and unwieldy. But the important thing was when he published it, he published the preface to Cromwell, which became the manifesto of Romanticism. And the important words in that manifesto were the grotesque and the sublime, juxtaposing those opposites. So you have the gargoyles on Notre Dame Cathedral. Those are grotesque. And then, it's sublime. The beautiful Gothic arches climbing heavenward. Or think of Quasimodo. He's grotesque. He's hunchback. But his soul, think of his soul, the beauty of that selfless, generous soul in Victor Hugo's novel, Notre Dame de Paris. So this is what Romanticism was all about. Well, who was best at doing grotesque and sublime? Shakespeare did it first, a couple centuries earlier. So another romantic was a poet-playwright was Alfred de Vigny, who did an adaptation of Othello, and it caused a riot because he kept a little bit too much of Shakespeare in it, even though a lot of it was bowdlerized. But what he did was when they talk about a handkerchief, he used the word mouchoir. And a mouchoir is something you blow your nose in. Ooh, and that's too vulgar for the refined. You don't say things like that on stage. Stage language is supposed to be more nuanced and perfect and delicate. And he should have used the word tissu, a little tissu. But he used mouchoir. And so people rioted because of that, as you see here. And they rioted at Victor Hugo's Hernani, but that was considered the opening of Romanticism, 1830, the riots of Hernani. And so all of the Romantics were interested in Shakespeare and influenced by Shakespeare in terms of combining strong action, sometimes edging towards some violence, and, Rigoletto, those things, edging toward violence, and also mixing comedy and tragedy, and just getting away with more than so. But still, they talked about Shakespeare, but they weren't seeing Shakespeare on the French stage. The best way to see Shakespeare in France was through imported operas from Italy. And as you see here, all of the Italians who had written Romeo and Juliet operas before Gounod wrote his. And so we had an example right here at Lyric Opera of Kansas City back in 2013 when we saw Bellini's the Capuletti e Montague. Anyway, Capulets and Montagues. So now we're moving into the next period after Romanticism, the middle of the 19th century. The middle of the 19th century was pretty much called realism. And that's very different from Romanticism. Romanticism is big, epic, Shakespearean. realism, paring it back down to the living room, the drawing room, the salon, and everyday things. As you see here, a couple of examples in painting of the real. Probably the most important influence was that the period of Second Empire, the realism, was the influence of the middle class. We're now down to people who had saved their money, worked hard, and now they could afford to go to the theater, but they wanted plays with middle class values. They wanted plays about themselves, people who save their money, who make good marriages for their daughters, who don't go with kept women, and go to the theater to see how to do home decor. They wanted interior decoration on the stage to know how to furnish their salons. So this, again, made people squeamish about Shakespeare all over again, because this is very much the opposite of what you would find in Shakespeare. So they could read translations, but they didn't want to see him on stage. Victor Hugo had to go into exile for political reasons. He was on the island of Jersey, and writing political things. But along came the 300th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth, and Victor Hugo was sort of the chairman of that effort in exile. And so he was directing, saying, we'll do all these things, and that'll really stick it to Emperor Louis Napoleon, won't it? So they were actually weaponizing Shakespeare. And so Victor Hugo and his romantic followers, leftover romantics in the realistic period, they didn't like Napoleon's nephew and his Second Empire. They wanted to go back to a republic. So Shakespeare was kind of an edge that they used. They planned a big banquet and sold 600 tickets, and then it was canceled by the government because it was considered it would be too dangerous. So that didn't happen. And of course, the English were outraged that the French were canceling Shakespeare. Victor Hugo wrote a little book about Shakespeare, and it was published exactly on the day when the banquet would have happened. And he wanted people to think of him, Victor Hugo, as the kind of French Shakespeare. And in a way, that's not too far. It's far-fetched in terms of total genius and capacity and quality and quantity, but in a way, there you can see. His son did the best translation of Shakespeare in the 19th century. And here we come to the librettists again, who worked with Gounod for his Romeo and Juliet. So they had a lot of translations of Shakespeare to draw on when they put together a libretto for Gounod. And they ended up being closer to the original Shakespeare than any opera libretto before them. Now, they still kept the David Garrick ending. So because, really, you need a love duet between Romeo and Juliet before they die. So it's totally understandable. I think we can forgive them for that. So this is where they worked on it for a couple of years, and Gounod was so happy with this process of composing it. And he wrote to his wife, it's the exhilaration of running down the beast and taming it. So Gounod was consciously trying to tame the beast Shakespeare in writing his opera, Roméo and Juliette. It got produced at this great big theater that still stands. It was later the Sarah Bernhardt Theater, and it was a moneymaker. The wife of the theater owner sang the role of Juliette. She was quite a good singer, but a horror to work with. She just made so many demands on poor Gounod. So you see the costumes, couple of costumes from that premiere production, Romeo Paris on a page. And the set for Act 2 in the garden, balcony scene, and Act 3 in the street. And then we go to Act 4, the long sequence of love duets in the bedroom on their night together. And then for Act 5 is in the tomb. The opening night, there was the opening of the Paris Exposition of 1867. And the producer, the theater owner, was told, you're not going to get an audience. They're all going to be at the World's Fair. But he went ahead with it, and there was a sold-out, raving audience. They loved it. And then they went to the World's Fair at midnight. And it was so popular, 102 performances. It was quite phenomenal. And here you see this newspaper cartoon about Romeo and Juliet at the opera. And it was revived just a few years later at the Opéra Comique, and then a decade after that at the Paris Opera. So that's a really good track record. Critics really did love the opera, very moved by it. And Gounod acknowledged that he had been influenced by Berlioz, but Berlioz was not an opera. So we really can credit Gounod with being the first successful French opera version of Romeo and Juliet. And this is, again, one of those love-hate things. We don't want to admit it, but that Shakespeare guy was not bad. And it's a big question now, given my title, did Gounod really tame the barbarian? I suppose you could say that, but I think it's more accurate to say that the opera completed the task of taming the French attitude towards Shakespeare, so that French became more open to Shakespeare after some of the little vulgarities that they saw in this beautiful, lyrical, passionate, emotional opera. And they understood that there could be this kind of knitting together of things that their grandparents would have considered in very, very bad taste. So, that's my ending. Okay. I thought I had a couple quotes there, but I left you maybe 5 minutes for questions. We've got about 8 minutes for questions, I think, if you have any.
Do you study the comparative literature on, like Chinese have a Chinese Hong Lou Meng? How does compare the two?
The two French.
I'm sorry. Maybe my question is too.
No, that's fine.
I'm sorry.
I wanted to. How did they compare?
Yeah, like West. Do you compare Eastern and Western? Show love and then family and how does it compare?
Wow. Yes, it's a big. In the long run, people are all the same. We have the same things that we care about. As you say, family and love and so on. But we are conditioned by what we grow up with, the culture in which we grow up, and what is considered fair game, or what are the rules that we have to abide by. So I think it's sometimes pretty hard to shake that off and to open up to something that is outside what we've grown up with. Yes.
You focused obviously on the French attitude towards Shakespeare. The English themselves had a very conflicted attitude towards Shakespeare for many centuries.
Yes. Very good point. Yes. Even Dryden, John Dryden, who, the great English poet and playwright, he wrote a play called All for Love. It was his version of Antony and Cleopatra. Well, Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra, you jump from Egypt to Rome, it's over a period of a couple of years. You have battles at sea, a little bit of everything. And John Dryden's All for Love has the whole Antony and Cleopatra story in 24 hours. Unity of time. Yes. So, yes, and he's English, and yet he was trying to be, observe classical form. And Shakespeare was crude because he couldn't stay within the rules. He was as though he was undisciplined. And if he thought of something, he'd throw it in. And from another point of view, that's not art. Art should be hard. Art should be within a box, right? It's just a whole different point of view. So yes, the English had. I mean, you hear of the Scottish play that had flying witches, but they loved flying machines. Or Midsummer Night's Dream, they cut it. The English cut down all the gaudiness, and instead they had a ballet of fairies. So yes, the English for mostly 18th century Restoration and into the 18th century, they too were, thought Shakespeare was too much, went overboard, needed to be tamed. Yes.
Just come up with another question. Because when I was in England, I feel like, okay, they are like Americans. I start talking to them, they were very composed. I feel like, oh, I'm in England, I'm not in the United States. So the same, how does Americans play Romeo and Juliet with different rendition from the play in England, for instance?
That's a good point. I think you're right. There have been comparisons, and I don't offhand, I can't tell you the statistics, but English actors speak Shakespeare faster than Americans do. I don't remember 18 words per second, whereas Americans 12 words per second, something like that. I made that up, but there is that difference that the English do it more by speech. That's the essential of it, whereas Americans need to throw in a lot of bodily motion that probably slows down the speech. Yes.
Going back to different countries, I think in Italy, unless I'm mistaken, I believe that Shakespeare was not well known really until the 1800s because there were so few translations with being the exception. But it wasn't until the 19th century that Verdi, for example, fell in love with Shakespeare.
Right.
But there were not many, other than Romeo and Juliet, there were not many in Italy. Tragically.
Yeah, that's true. And did you have a question?
Well, I just
Let me come back there because I don't hear very well.
We're wondering if you had seen any of the current rehearsals and if you had a comment about the current production at the Lyric.
Oh, yes. Oh, did you see it?
No, I haven't seen it. Not yet, not till Sunday.
Oh, okay. Oh, I see. I thought you were referring to the 2013 Capulets and Montagues.
If you had a comment about the current production,
okay,
we're going to be seeing.
I have not seen it, so I don't know. I've seen some photographs. That's from the production we will see. So more the romantic period style. It won't be like the Capulets and the Montagues where it was modern dress and in a like a prison setting. This will be right in a more traditional operatic format. And that's as much as I know. And any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming.
Thank you.